Hi, I'm Dolen Perkins-Valdez, and I'm a historical fiction writer. When I'm not writing, I'm teaching. When I'm not teaching, I'm playing with my kids. But the place I love to be the most is in the library. I love to read historical fiction. It just transports me. So I decided to start this book club. Here together, we will read stories featuring women's histories. We'll talk to writers, we'll have discussions. It'll be fun. Come on and join us. Hi, Marcela.
Hi, Dolen.
How are you?
I'm doing great. I just want to say thank you so much for having me and thank you for making this book club. This is really great.
Well, we can't have a book club if you writers don't join us. And I know you've been really busy promoting the book and doing all the writerly things. So I just want to thank you for joining us. Such a treat.
I'm so happy to be here.
Well, y'all, we are here to discuss Marcela's debut. I can't even believe this is your debut novel. It's so well done. I mean, you have a pushcart prize though, so you've been working for a long time, right? You've been
I have.
honing your craft. This is amazing. It's such an amazing book, and I'm eager to talk to you about it. Why don't we start with the title?
Sure.
You know, my interpretation of the Spanish is that it's like bad women. Is that the idea behind malas?
I always love that question because number one, I was really excited that the publisher didn't ask me to use an English title, but also it is roughly translated to bad women. I think in English it sounds like like bad girls, like they're just
Mhm.
there's a kind of juvenalia to it, like, oh, they're bad girls. But in Spanish, malas really has more of a layer of wickedness.
Mm.
They're kind of wicked women, like, they're of course I'm not going to use the title wicked because that's already out, right? But there's a kind of almost an element of just, I don't want to say evil, but kind of.
Mhm. Yeah, I got that. And also it's sort of connected to like the word curse, right? Like
Mhm.
curses.
Yes, yes. It definitely has a connotation of something really. In like I said, in English, the word "bad" just doesn't really have that ring.
Yeah.
But I do feel like there's a kind of wickedness. There's a kind of um, curse or some kind of almost like supernatural thing that is affecting the lives of the women in the novel. So yeah, that's where the idea of malas comes from.
Mhm. And, you mentioned that you were glad that the publisher didn't force you to have an English language title. I just wanna say I love how you've incorporated Spanish in the book, and you do so without translation for the most part. And it's not just Spanish. I mean, sometimes some of my writing students will put very sort of like textbook Spanish in their novels, and I'm like, people don't really talk like that, right? But you have like idiomatic expressions that don't even quite translate to English, right? Like
Mhm.
there's one moment where Pilar is imagining what her husband would say if she had told him that she thought she was pregnant, and you use that phrase "no hay mal que por bien no venga," which
Mhm.
basically is sort of like there's nothing bad that something good doesn't come out of, or something like that. But it doesn't have like a direct translation, right?
I think that, and then that's the thing with translating, is that you're trying to capture an idea, but
Hmm.
it's not usually going to come from the same exact words in another language. And I
Right.
think in this case, it really translates to something like every cloud has a silver lining.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
translates, but of course, like none of those words are in the Spanish, right? It
Right.
translates to that. And I think that, I mean, that's the art of the translation. That is really difficult, I think, to, unless you are actually speaking with someone who can give you those nuances, like it can be hard to. I've had a lot of questions like, well, why isn't there a glossary? And I'm like, well, even if you had one, it wouldn't necessarily,
Capture.
yeah, it wouldn't capture it. And I think that's a mysterious art that translators have. I am not necessarily a translator. I mean, there is a Spanish language copy, but a real translator did it, not me.
Well, it's wonderful because, in the literary world, we've been having this conversation for a long time, Marcella, right? About whether, when you're writing in the context of, an American or English speaking, I should say, audience, do you translate? And I've always been on the side of no, particularly with Spanish, because
Mhm.
it is, to me, one of our national languages, even if the US doesn't acknowledge it as such. And I feel like, um, we need to, at the very least, just look it up, right? Like it shouldn't, and then the question comes, like, in terms of the writer, who are you writing for, right?
Mhm.
Are you writing? Because if you do speak Spanish and you've got a writer who's translating everything, then it can feel really condescending.
That's true. And I think there's a balance. I definitely know that early in the writing, there was a lot more Spanish,
Mhm.
and I had to kind of decide, like, okay, what am I willing to leave in, and what is maybe not necessarily going to change the affect that could be in English. So, and it wasn't so much that I absolutely had to consider everyone, but more just like, well, what is still going to retain that world, and what, it's any kind of revision, right, where you're like, well, do they need to know all of this? Probably not.
Now, was that just in your head, or was that something you were working out with your editor?
No, actually, my editor never actually asked me to translate anything. she
Oh,
was
wow.
No, she never did. Her she I mean, I feel like I'm very lucky that she was kind of like just here for it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that was more um during when I would be in workshops sometimes, and I would get some resistance. And I really feel like things changed. So I took a long time to write this novel.
How long did it take, Marcella?
Probably like 12 years. I'm not
Wow.
going to tell you that I was at the desk writing every day for 12 years. It was just, I
I
had started it.
understand. Yeah,
Yeah.
you had a life, you were living life and
I was
writing.
living life, and I was, being a mom, and
Mm.
decided to, I did a lot of things rather than write. I was like, oh, I have all these other things to do. And then all this time went by. But I think there was definitely, I feel like in the late 90s and maybe the early aughts, there was a sense of like, well, you can put the language in italics and then put a comma and then like the translation. And
I
I just
remember
found
that.
it
Mhm,
really clunky, like,
mhm.
because it kind of takes you out of the moment, at least for
Right.
me. Um, and it was when I decided to go back to the book, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do it, whatever, I'm going to do it. I had been thinking about it for a long time, and I took a workshop at Tin House, and
Oh.
just trying to go back to, like, I had been out of my MFA program for many years at that point.
Mhm.
And a young Latino was like, no, you don't have to italicize it anymore. Like, we're not doing that anymore. And I was like, you're right, I don't have to. And so
Mhm.
I was very happy to, like, hear that from someone who was of my community, and who was really, like, just kind of supportive of me saying, like, no, this is just part of the language.
Mhm.
And so that was kind of my journey on that, just thinking about, like, how things have changed a little bit. And there are other books, like there's Solito. I think
Mhm.
that's Javier Zamora, like his title is in Spanish, and Hombrecito, that's Santiago Jose Sanchez. Their book is also with a Spanish title. And I
Mhm.
think that is just becoming more accepted as
Yeah.
this idea that language is not just this is one and this is the other, that there's the commingling as with all cultures.
Mhm. I love that. I love that. And that just goes to show why it's so important to have someone in your workshop. Was this your workshop leader or a workshop peer?
No, this was my peer. And not saying the workshop leader was telling me something different, but
Yeah, no, I was gonna say it's why it's so important to have someone in your workshop who's a good reader for you. Do you know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah, he really was. He's a good reader, and just it was good to hear somebody tell me
Yeah,
like, "Hey, you don't have to explain yourself; just
yeah.
do it." Um, which I'm not saying that later I haven't had a lot of questions who are like from people who are like, "What is the glossary?" I'm like, "I don't. It's not 1994 anymore. Sorry."
Well, I love it, and I love where we are on that in the literary world. It was to me so much of the charm of this book, and it really set me down in that world, you know? Because I never I figured often, even though the conversations were written in English, there were times when the characters were speaking Spanish, right? Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
But it's written in English, and I got that. And because you did that, it allowed me to enter that world in a way that my mind could understand it. You know what I mean?
I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, I certainly was like, well, I hope that people can still,
Yeah.
get something out of it, even if they're not like from South Texas or from the border or whatever. And it seems like that. So I'm really glad.
Well, let's talk about your inspiration for the book. I mean, this is a book, and in this book club, we feature books that have women at the center of them and women's experiences. And so, to that, this book is perfect for the book club. But this is a book told about these women from really different times.
Mhm.
Pilar, who is from I guess was a young woman in the 1950s, and then Lulu, who is a young woman in the 1990s. Tell us a little bit about what inspired you in terms of these women and um, you know, what when you set out to write this book, what were you thinking you wanted to write?
Um, I honestly, the first thing that I did at the first chapter, actually, I was in my MFA program and I was taking a fairy tales class. And so the professor asked us to write a fairy tale. And then I immediately, with my own background, I was just like, I want to write something inspired by La Llorona, which is the most mala of them all, right? She's a terrible lady who,
Mhm.
um, the legend is that she was a young girl who is seduced by she's like a from the poorer class, sometimes she's mestiza, sometimes she's indigenous, and she's seduced by a man from the upper class in colonial times,
Mhm.
and he swears he loves her and all this, but he sometimes in some stories he marries her and sometimes he doesn't, but he does leave her. And of course, it's a very Medea type of story. So in her rage, she like drowns their kids and then immediately is overcome with guilt and remorse and then drowns herself. And the legend is, and of course, the legend they tell to all the little kids, right? That her ghost haunts the river at night, and she's La Llorona because she's weeping and
Yeah.
weeping for the things that she's done.
Mhm.
Um, and if you see her and your little kid, she's going to get you and like drag you to the river and drown you because she's looking for her kids and your kid and all that. And I found like, of course, that has always, made a big impression on me and many other Latina people out there, I'm sure. But the thing that I really cared about that it ended up that I couldn't write a fairy tale was that she doesn't have a personality. She's just like
Mhm.
this cautionary tale of like, look what happens if you have sex before you get married. Then you're going to end up haunting the river at night. Like, it's very like all these terrible things. And it's really that I wanted to write a story where I don't want to say understand her, but I wanted to humanize her. And so Pilar came to me as this character who's like this young, pregnant wife. And but she's like, it's a young family. She has a little boy and she's pregnant and, ostensibly happy. But then, this old woman comes and is like, oh, that's my husband. That's my husband. And even though Pilar is young and her husband is young and this lady's like an old lady, And everyone else is like, that chick's crazy. Like, she's an old lady. She is not married to your husband. There's enough insecurity in Pilar that it kind of like allows her to open herself to the possibility that she really is going to be cursed by this woman. Um, and so that was kind of the beginning of that. And then like the other part of it came maybe a year later, and it was a young girl in a different time, same place, different time, the early 90s, and she's like 14, and she's so mad at her dad.
Mhm.
And that feeling of like being angry with someone who isn't being honest with you, and you're like 14, and you're like, the world is so unfair, which, I mean, a lot of that is the teenage angst, but also, when you don't feel valued, and you're a little kid and don't know how to process that. I mean, that's literally the textbook at-risk youth, right?
Mhm.
uh, and I realized that what they had in common was that they wanted things that the world was telling them that it was not okay to want. And that's kind of where the story came from.
Interesting. And so both of them, one thing that's really palpable for both of them is their rage. Like, you said that Lulu was very angry at her father, but Pilar is really angry at Jose Alfredo too. Like, she can barely contain it. I mean, she does contain it really in a lot of ways because she keeps it beneath the surface for a while. But,
Mhm.
um, you know, when you think of the La Llorona legend, do you think of her as a woman of rage? Of
Of the legend,
Yeah.
I think so. I think that there's like this fear of women, and she's kind of
Mhm,
the epitome of that, right? She's like supposed to be this loving mother, and then she
mhm,
does these things. And I think that it's not necessarily that like she's just wrathful all the time, but that like that moment means that everything is just grief after that for her.
mhm, mhm,
And I think for Pilar, it's almost the opposite. Like
mhm,
she has, because of the tragedies that befall her in her life, like there's so much grief, but there's not a way to express her grief.
mhm.
Everyone's kind of like, just get over it. Every cloud has a silver lining, right? Like every cloud has a
Yeah.
silver lining, and she's just like, I don't want to hear that. Like I want for people to validate what I'm going through, and this is real, and I don't. And so I think it's almost like she has a lot of rage, but it's coming from a place of deep grief that
Sure.
ultimately is her undoing. Um, and also just this idea that like you're supposed to not there's some time limit on grief, right? Like there's a little while when people will be like, "Oh, here's flowers, here's something for you, here's," and then they're done, and you're supposed to be done too a lot of times, right? Like people
Mhm,
become uncomfortable if you don't move along. And I think that Pilar, a lot of her anger is about that she's not ready to move on because like these
mhm,
are really hard things for her.
mhm, mhm. Yes, and for Lulu, there's also a sense of grief, right? I feel.
Mhm.
Um, she feels very, abandoned by her father, and there is also a sense of the family wanting her to kind of move on and sort of, you know, um,
Kinda
really,
get with the program.
yeah. Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's often the case. Like we have all these expectations of how you're supposed to behave and how you're
Mhm,
supposed to be, like how you're supposed to feel, which
mhm,
I think is even harder than how you're supposed to behave. Like, oh, you should feel this way, you should not feel this other
mhm,
way. And I think she definitely, Lulu, was, I think, sometimes even hard to write, not because I mean, don't get me wrong, it was delightful to pretend I was 14, right? I was like, oh, I'm so tired of adulting. Let me just write all this about this crazy little kid who's going to be, doing all this stuff. But a lot of the things that she's doing is because, like, people, like the adults in her life, are not paying attention to her, and that makes her very angry. And there is a sense of grief, and I think for her, it's that she loves her dad so much, and he is kind of wrapped up in his own. And the thing, like, I think the heartbreaking thing is that, like, he loves her. He really
I
loves her.
get that sense too, that he loves her.
He
I get
loves her so much, but he is a messy, messy man.
But, I was telling you before we began the call that I didn't judge him. Like, I knew he was flawed and I got it, and, Jose Alfredo was doing things that I also did not like and agree with. But even with the messiness of all the characters, really, you crafted them with such care that I never stood in judgment. Like, I never was like, I hate him, like I felt like, I felt like I had known men like him,
I mean,
honestly.
there probably are a lot of guys out there who are really flawed and
Yeah,
have, whatever toxic masculinity and whatever
absolutely.
addiction issues, but also, are they charming? Yes.
And do they love their children? Yes.
Yes. And I think that ultimately that was the thing I wanted to get across, is that, like,
Yeah.
it's not a novel where it's like, oh, these men, they're so terrible. I mean, they are terrible, but, like, they're not only terrible. They're like human beings who have a lot of love. Like, even Jose Alfredo, he loves Pilar.
Yeah, he does. I can
He
see
loves
that.
her. And I think that's maybe the hardest thing for to really think about, is that, like, somebody can be really terrible and love you with all their heart. That's so
Mhm.
tough. Because then there's nothing you can say, like, oh, well, they did it because they don't like me, or they did it for,
Right.
like, no, it's not about you. Like, it's just not, whatever things they're doing, it's probably not because of you. Um, and so I did want to craft characters who, like, had that you could feel empathy for, not,
Mhm.
I mean, I don't even know if there's a character who's like, I'm a good person and I never did anything wrong. Like, I don't know if there's one in this novel.
Right. Well, to me, I feel like, isn't that what fiction is supposed to do, right? Like, isn't it supposed to reveal the kind of our inconsistencies and our contradictions and our messiness? You know what I mean? Like, at least that's the kind of fiction I like to read, I should say.
I was just telling, I also teach, so I was telling my students that earlier. I was like, no one wants to read a story where someone, like, pays their taxes on time, makes their bed every day, flosses twice a day, and, like, that's their whole life. No one wants to read that
Right.
story. Like,
Well, my
everyone
one
wants to be that person. They don't want to read about that person.
exactly. We were just in workshop today. One of my students had submitted a story about a woman who finds out that her fiance is cheating and she leaves him. And of course, me being the messy writer that I am, I said, what if she married him anyway? Like, like, that's to me like what fiction does. It shows us, like, you find out this person is not a good person and then you still marry them. Like, that's the part that
That's the story. Then you're like, oh my God,
that's
why?
exactly, that's a story.
That's the story. Like, wow, really? Why? And then
Yeah,
the why is, like, whatever happens.
that's right.
Oh
So,
yeah.
and okay, so if anyone has a question for Marcela, please put it in the chat and I'll share questions with her. So, looking for questions, and I'll just continue talking while, if you are on Instagram or YouTube or Facebook, if you can put it in the chat, and I will ask Marcela here live. You had so much authority, Marcela, with so much in the book, like horse culture. I mean, did you ride horses growing up? You did.
Yes. I am the cliche Texan who had horses.
So
Yes.
I wondered, I mean, there was just a lot of, and you grew up in a border town, is that?
Mhm.
Yeah. But this town is not a real town, right? This is,
No, it's not a real town. When I was researching, there was so much, every little border town had their own specific history, particularly with the civil rights movement.
mm,
There were just so many, and I wanted to, kind of give an impression of it, but I didn't want to, like, name it something and then change what happened. If you know what I mean, I wanted to honor what really happened in the different towns, but also not be tied to, like, well, it has to be, there has to be a, spinach processing plant or whatever that there is, and so I wanted to give that, without, uh, not honoring the like a real history from a real specific place.
Mhm.
So this is a fictitious town that's kind of an amalgamation of several towns.
Okay, someone wants to know if there is a music playlist for the book.
Oh yeah, there definitely is. It's on Spotify. I think I can send the link. Hang on one second. Hopefully not accidentally play it. One second. Um, I can send the link here. I posted it before on my Instagram, but hang on.
So I just want to tell y'all, make sure you follow Marcela on Instagram. Her Instagram, let me just see if I
Okay.
can.
I think I sent a private chat, or is it?
Oh, here, let me see if I can. Well, they won't be able to copy the link address, but what I can do is put your.
So if you go to my website and scroll
Yeah.
down, it'll say listen to the Mala's playlist.
And your website is just your name,
Yeah,
right?
it's just marcelafuentes.com.
Okay. So I'm just going to put the website up for those of you to take a look at Marcela's website. Also follow her on all her socials, Instagram. Uh,
I think there's an extra period in the website, but that's
oh, there
okay.
is?
Yeah,
Sorry. Let me
right
go
after
through
that.
that.
Yeah, there you go. And then just scroll down and it'll say order Malas or listen to the playlist.
Oh,
Click.
yeah. It doesn't matter because they weren't going to be able to click on it anyway. It was
Okay,
just something to show.
that's fine. So yeah, it's a free Spotify playlist. And in fact, that was it is a music novel. And that was one of the ways that I kind of dealt with history, is to kind of talk about Tejano music, and, Gen X music and kind of the crossovers there. But it was a way also for me to stay in touch with my book, because it had taken so long to write it that
Mhm.
I had made playlists for all the characters. Like, what would they be listening to? What is Julio listening to as he goes to break up with his lover or whatever? Like, and so I would do those kinds of things. And then Viking was like, can you just like make us like one playlist that's kind of, so this is like kind of it's not all the songs, but it's kind of the main songs of the book. And then, I probably have hundreds of songs other than that, but the
Well,
playlist.
there is some Selena on that playlist for those.
Oh yeah. Well, I really wanted to write something joyful about Selena because I am a huge fan. I've always been a huge
Are
fan.
you?
Yes. Yes, I love Selena so much. So for those of you who have not read it, there is a scene in the book where the characters go to see Selena in concert. And I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying that there's no ugly things in the book. So there's no Yolanda. There's none. We don't even see her. We don't know her.
Thank goodness. Yeah, thank goodness. No Yolanda.
No, I mean, there is a Yolanda, but she's a different Yolanda. It's not her. It's like somebody that's related to Lulu.
She's Yoli, right?
Yeah,
Yoli.
Aunt Yoli is a Yolanda, but she's not the Yolanda.
So someone said that Lulu was grieving her grandma. So we didn't mention that when we were talking about the grief that's weighing her down. And yes, that's true.
She is. Romy is her grandma, and
Mhm.
Pilar and Romy were best friends once upon a time, and that's kind of how they end up meeting. But she is really grieving her. Romy is kind of the only adult who is her linchpin. She's like the only one who's like still holding it together. But unfortunately, Romy's like 90 years old at the beginning of Lulu's section. And so, yeah, it's very hard for her to not have like at least one constant in her life.
Tell me, how did you figure out the structure for the book? Because, I never read reviews before I read a book. I literally just take like word of mouth recommendations. So I dive right in and I'm reading, Pilar for, I don't know, 2 or 3 chapters. And then I'm like, we're in 1994. And I didn't know the connection at first. And then I realized that it was Romy's granddaughter, and I remembered her from. But tell me how were you? Because you said that Lulu came to you later. How did
Mm-hmm.
you figure out how to do the structure?
Oh, that was so tough. And honestly, I guess I just go back to the same thing that I always say, like the best way to learn to write is to read. And I read Rebecca Mackay's The Great Believers. And when
Wonderful.
I read that, I was like, oh my God, this is how I need to do it. Because I wanted to write a story in which only the reader knows the whole story.
Mhm.
Because like any family story, no one is going to have all the details, right? Like I will guarantee everybody listening right now, your grandma is hiding a secret from you. Like you don't know who she was when she was 21 or
I
17 or
know.
whatever. And so,
Or your mom.
or your mom, right? Like you don't know what there's some malas out there who may have reformed. You never know. But, but but I wanted to tell this story in a way that like Lulu would have a piece and her dad would have a piece and Romy would have a piece and Jose Alfredo would have, and so that only the reader knows because only the reader sees it all. Because if you're in that family, you're not going to know the whole thing, which is often, I think, kind of hard. Like if you are aware that you don't know it, it can be hard. Yeah.
Okay, someone wants to know about your decision to make Julio gay.
Julio is not gay.
Oh, I don't know. Judy asked this question.
Do we mean Oscar? Or do we mean the nephew, Carlos?
Okay, let's see if they clarify. Haven't got.
Carlos is gay.
Well, let's
Louis.
talk about Carlos then, because
Okay.
I thought maybe I had missed something. So let's talk about Carlos, the cousin, Judy
I
said.
love that because nobody ever asks about Carlos. I wanted there to be something for like something that Yolanda was also just dealing with. And for me, like I definitely wanted there to be representation of, you know, of people who were gay or
Mhm,
bisexual. Like
mhm,
Oscar absolutely is bi. Um, but I wanted there to be this a thing for Lulu to look at her family and be like, everybody's lying to me. Everybody's lying to me.
mhm,
Because one of
mhm,
the things that happens is that Yolanda is not going to let her husband cut off their son, but
mhm,
she can't admit who he is either. And it's like
mhm,
not good enough. Like it's just not good enough to say, which is again when she's like, oh, my husband's cheating on me. That's why I'm not, like she'd rather tell this ridiculous lie about her husband than admit
mhm,
that her son is gay, even though she loves him. And
mhm,
even though she will continue to support him financially and she wants him to, she wants to, but she's just not like it's like still this idea that like, oh, but I don't want people to know that about us. I don't want people to
mhm.
know. And honestly, I guess thinking about the time of the 90s,
Yeah.
it was very repressive. I'm not saying it was more repressive than earlier times or
Well, it was
but
still very repressive. I think maybe people who weren't, young people at that time may not remember, but it was, it was not like as accepting as it is now for sure.
it wasn't. And I feel like what was happening, especially in that moment, like that there was just not a lot of care for queer people.
Yeah.
And I was really wanting Yolanda to be someone who, again, loves her son so much, but
Mhm,
can't fully embrace him. Like
mhm,
she's like, I would rather tell everyone that my husband is a lying, cheating guy than
mhm,
say the real reason that I'm not with him right now is because, he won't accept my son's homosexuality. Like
mhm,
because she doesn't really either.
mhm,
Um, and I feel like Carlos is maybe not as he's not as big of a character in the book, but he's certainly someone that Lulu loves very much, but
yes.
feels also like he's dealing with something else that I can't even deal. Like not that she doesn't want to deal with it, but like it's so much bigger and more remote from her.
Mhm,
Um, and I think she just isn't. She's maybe like not old enough to really fully grasp like how bad this is for him,
mhm.
even though she loves him. Yeah.
Well, and to me, that just goes into what I was saying earlier about you building these people so three-dimensionally because, everything is so complicated, right? Like everything that they're dealing with, whether it be what Carlos is dealing with his mother and parents or what Lulu is dealing with her father, um, and loss of her grandmother and mother, right?
Mhm.
And so there's just layer after layer after layer within the family, which I think is, one of the reasons why I just felt like I knew all these people. I just felt that way. So we're coming to the end of our time. I guess I don't know if I should ask you what you're working on next. I hope the next one doesn't take 12 years, Marcella.
Oh, no, 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 it
Take that
doesn't.
long.
No, no, no. That was the 12 years was literally me being like, "I don't know if I can. I don't have that." Like, when you just have really imposter syndrome and, like, the
Mhm.
town I'm from, when I was little, there was a B. Dalton's, but there's no bookstore there now, and
We must be the same age because B. Dalton was my only bookstore too, growing up in Tennessee, and people were and like that was it. It was a B. Dalton,
it
and
was a B. Dalton's, and they had, like, you could buy Stephen King and John Grisham, but there was not, like,
it was in the
literary.
mall. Was yours in the mall?
Yes. I was in the mall. Um, but so what I'm working on is a linked collection, and I'm turning my edits in January 1st.
A linked collection of stories. Wow.
Mhm.
And edits January 1st. Oh my gosh, that's exciting.
Yeah, so it's almost done. And that's my December is going to be just that, just getting everything as tight as I can. And that is a linked collection called My Heart Has More Rooms Than a Whorehouse.
Ooh, what a
From
title.
It's from the line in Love in the Time of Cholera, where
Um,
by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, where Florentino is like just out there with all these loves, and he's disgusted with himself, and he's just like, "Oh my God, my heart
mhm,
has more rooms than a whorehouse."
mhm,
But in this case, it's a linked story collection about what it is like to be a woman in a really large family,
mhm,
and how you often have these kind of obligations and duties, and every person that you love has a room in your heart, and if you have a big family and you're close with them, you know that makes you vulnerable, because any one of them, if anything happens, or they need you or whatever, and it's really about that kind of like making a space for yourself
mhm.
when you have that. Which I don't know that everyone has a big family, but like I always say that if I was going to be an orphan, they would have to crash like 4 jumbo jets full of people.
So you're from a big family.
I am from a large family, which one of the weird things about Lulu is that she's really not. And I was like, this is so weird. I don't even know what this is like.
Wow. Well, I'm so excited about this new book. When do you have a pub date yet?
I don't yet. I think it'll be like I have ish. I guess it's either the end of 2025 or sometime in 2026.
Okay.
So that's yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Marcella, for joining us. And, all I can say, y'all, if you have not read Mala, let's say you might be catching this broadcast later at some point. Look, we're both going to hold up our
Here
copy.
we go. There it is.
Make sure to get this book. You are going to love it. I literally felt like I disappeared for
Oh my
several
God.
days while I was reading this book. It's like so rich. Characters are so real, and I don't think I'm going to forget these characters, Marcella.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. That's
Yeah,
really lovely.
I'm
Thank
gonna
you.
I'm gonna keep Lulu in my heart and Pilar too. Poor Pilar. Just y'all, please read this book if you have not.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
listen to the playlist, and you can also get it on Audible.
Yes,
Uh,
and follow Marcella on her socials. I'll link her socials on my Instagram page. So make sure you follow her so that you can be ready when that new book comes out.
oh my gosh. Thank you for having me. Thank
Thank
you, everybody
you.
who's here. Thank you, everybody who's going to come in and watch it on YouTube later. Like, thank you all so much. I just have
Yeah.
had such a great time. Thank you.